Greetings, adventurers, and welcome back to the Lorkhon Saga Nutshell series. Ascendance is coming. This new story is the culmination of 5 years of ideas and storytelling, and in anticipation of the series, I have decided to create a collection of Lorkhon Saga Nutshell videos that will answer all of your burning questions about the story and how the concept was born. Now, in the last episode, we talked about the origin of the ideas that drove the concept of a story with multiple characters and interwoven storylines. In this episode, we are going to focus on the lore behind the series, how it came to be, how it works, and what makes a story a Lorkhon tale. Now, just a quick warning, we are getting into actual Lorkhon Saga lore here, which means if you haven't watched the story in full, there are going to be spoilers here. Just letting you know. There will definitely be spoilers in this video and all of the videos following this, so just be aware of that. Okay, so in review, the idea for the concept of having multiple characters with crossing storylines, as we talked about in the last episode, started really officially in May of 2015 with the Character Crusade podcast, episode 4, part 1, Project Epicosity. If you haven't seen that video, go back and watch video 1, or also take a look in the description of video 1, and you will find links to all the relevant podcasts having to do with the concept. Now, fast forward to November 16th, 2015. The 5 Fables prologue drops. This is my first attempt at the concept of a multiple character storyline. By this point, I had already given up on the idea of using the Familiar Faces mod to achieve this. Now, it's not because Familiar Faces couldn't do it, it's because my plans were much grander, much bigger, and the idea of playing a single character through, stopping, playing another character through, stopping, was not appealing to me. What I really wanted to do is mix them from the start. I wanted to have kind of a dynamic, overlapping story from the very beginning. Well, this forced me down the road of actually making my own mods so this could happen. I really needed 5 separate characters as player characters, so each one with its own save, obviously. And then I also needed an NPC for each of those 5 characters, and I was also going to need consistent NPCs for any characters that were not player characters, but were, so to speak, bit players or supporting characters that would be basically across all of those stories as well. So in the end, I created quite a few NPC mods to make all of this work. Now, there were some limitations here. My ability to make NPC mods was limited. I really wasn't interested in trying to create custom voiced NPC mods, because the plan was that I was going to voice these characters in real time while recording the videos. All right? So there were some issues with that. One of those, of course, was that when my characters appeared in-game as NPCs, they were going to have a vanilla Skyrim voice, and I was going to be kind of asking the audience to suspend disbelief with that, or just brush it aside and allow me to do the voice work, right? So this was a concept that was by no means perfect. However, had I created voiced NPCs, there would have also been limitations as well. So I really was just getting into this idea of making NPCs, kind of learning it, and at the time, I was really anxious to get the story going and wasn't willing to put in the time to create 10 custom voiced NPCs. All right. So basically what happens is fairly shortly after that, by April 15th, the idea had failed. It had fizzled out for me. 5 Fables really became a failure due to its own scale and ambition. It was so big and it was so involved from the very start that it became extremely difficult to produce, and I realized this very, very quickly. So, really, what was the key problem here? First of all, the story arc and the antagonist were too specific. It was too narrow. It was too restrictive, and it was too linear. What I learned from this experience is that if I was going to do this, I needed to find a way to do it organically, and I needed to have a larger story concept that was broad enough that I could build just about anything into it I wanted to, and not worry so much about how tight my plot line was. So eventually, Five Fables fizzles out. Now, some very good things came of Five Fables. As I mentioned in the previous episode, Robard and Stax, those two characters, came from that series. I loved them so much that I carried them forward. I was not prepared to let them go. I think also that Five Fables is where I did some of my best and most creative production work. I learned a whole bunch of things about creating cutscenes, about using editing tools. This is also where I upgraded my tool set, and I started using Adobe tools exclusively for video production, and it had a huge impact on my capabilities and the kind of sort of polished content I could produce. So to this day, the intro to the Five Fables series is probably the single piece of production work that I am most proud of. And every once in a while, I'll go back and look at it. Everything from the visuals to the music to how I put it together, given where my skills were at the time I created it, I always look back on it and think, well, that was a real milestone for me. That was a moment in which I really reached further to see what I could do in terms of video production. All right, so what comes next? On March 2nd of 2017, the series Ashes is launched. This is really the birth of the Lorkhon saga narrative. Now, leading up to March 2nd, I had spent quite a bit of time working on this idea of what would be a concept I could use that would be broad enough, that I could tie a bunch of characters into it. One of the things that I learned from Five Fables is in that series, I tried to have a primary antagonist, like a singular bad guy that was causing all the trouble. This time around, I thought, well, if I really want something that is a broad umbrella that I can tell lots of stories inside, what if it's not a singular bad guy? What if it's simply the environment? The environment has turned against us. That seems broad enough, sweeping enough that it can have larger effects on everyone, but I don't have to worry about a singular bad guy that's having to make multiple appearances and having to do all kinds of complicated things across multiple storylines. So I came up with this concept of Lorkhon particles. So let's talk a little bit about what these are. Okay? So in the last episode, we talked a little bit about the god Lorkhon. Well, I'm going to allow you to go out to UESP if you really want to check out the full story on Lorkhon. But the Cliff Notes version is that Lorkhon was a troublemaker. Basically, Lorkhon tricked the gods into creating humans. And when these gods understood that they had been tricked, they became enraged and they killed Lorkhon. And not only did they kill Lorkhon, but they scattered the parts of his body all across Nirn so that he could never come back again. The key here is that according to these stories, according to the myth, the heart of Lorkhon goes to Morrowind and falls down into Red Mountain, which is a huge volcano. It's kind of the centerpiece of Morrowind in a lot of ways. There are a lot of interesting things that have happened, a lot of stories and interesting bits of lore that have happened around this mountain over several games in the Elder Scrolls series. So if you want to check that out, I would go out and check the wiki. How that plays into this, however, is that obviously volcanoes are constantly producing ash. And what we're talking about is ash and the particles within it that have been sitting inside the volcano for hundreds of years in close proximity to an item of incredible power. So imagine, the heart of Lorkhon is sitting in this volcano, surrounded by volcanic rock, molten lava, ash, all of these things. And it is slowly and steadily over the course of hundreds of years leaching power into all of these elements. And now the volcano is constantly erupting. It's spewing things up into the air, and in particular, ash, which is floating on the prevailing winds and settling in Skyrim. Now, one of the things that we learn in Skyrim as part of the Dragonborn DLC is that the NPC character Neloth is a Telvanni wizard of great power and supposedly ancient himself. He's got this theory that the Heartstones that you find on Solstheim contain some remnants of power related to the heart of Lorkhon. Well, along comes Marlivor Keenlit. He is one of two primary characters in the Ashes story. Marlivor is a compatriot of Neloth. He is also a Telvanni wizard, but he has a competing theory, and his theory is that there is not only power inside the Heartstones, there is power contained in everything that comes out of the mouth of that volcano, especially the ash. And he refers to this power in particulate form as Lorkhon particles, and he writes a treatise about it. Now, when the Ashes story drops, one of the first things we hear is an audio-only piece as kind of a teaser where we learn a bit about Marl's theories. We also learn that the wizards of House Telvanni do not necessarily accept Marl's hypothesis. They seem to be firmly on the side of Neloth, and many are actively attempting to discredit Marl. Now, we're going to talk about Marl's predicament in a lot more detail when we do his character segment, but some of these things are important because obviously Marl is the one who is kind of coming up with the theory that drives what the Lorkhon particles are. So in the story, he is considered to be the preeminent authority when it comes to Lorkhon particles, what they are, where they settle, the effects that they have, and any research having to do with the particles. Okay? So that is important to know. So what we know is we know that the particles are formed from power leached away from the heart of Lorkhon, ejected into the air from a volcano, floating on the prevailing winds to Skyrim, and then they settle into Skyrim. Now, once they're in Skyrim, they settle in different concentrations. Areas where you have high concentrations of ash, you have higher instances of Lorkhon particle effects. So let's talk a little bit about these effects. Lorkhon particles have magical effects on people. And Lorkhon particles can be ingested through water, through inhalation, through eating crops or livestock that's been grown in soil where the Lorkhon particles or ash from Red Mountain is mixed in. All of these things have accumulated over time, and over time now we have power that was leached away from the heart of Lorkhon, leaching into the soil and water supplies, plants and animals of Skyrim. And the presence of these particles have varying effects on the people of Skyrim. In some cases, the effects of the particles are completely inert. In other words, some citizens of Skyrim are not affected in any way by the particles. They live a normal life. Others become imbued with power. Some are driven insane One of the objectives that Marl has during the course of the story in Ashes is to try to understand what about the physiology of an individual would cause a Lorkhon particle to have a positive or a negative effect. And so what this does is it creates a scenario in which we can use the particles as a way of explaining all of the incredible things that are happening in this short window of time in Skyrim. We have bandits everywhere who are extremely violent. We have a civil war that has suddenly broken out. We have a province that is awash in relics, is under siege by vampires and dragons. Now we suddenly have the Eye of Magnus, which shows up out of nowhere, right? And has this mysterious power that we don't understand. We have all of this swirling conflict that is steeped in magic going on in Skyrim in this very short period of time and in this very concentrated way. So by introducing this concept of the Lorkhon particles, we are able to sort of explain why these things would be happening in Skyrim at this time. And it also creates the basis for the Ashes story, which is about Marl, in part anyway, about Marl trying to figure out what is the mystery of these particles? How can I unlock the potential of these particles? How can I understand how these particles affect people differently and why? And ultimately, how can I protect the populace from the negative effects of these particles? All right? So we've got this concept churning along of power attracts power. Suddenly we've got this province awash in power, and all of these incredible things are happening there. So really, the lore around the Lorkhon particles, the Lorkhon saga, is creating this larger umbrella narrative that helps us explain a lot of the things that are going on in Skyrim at this time. Now, why is this important? Well, if we go back to the first episode of the Nutshell series, I talked a little bit about this. This is important because we need an overarching story that we can use to tie a whole bunch of things together. What is the glue that we can use to make characters relate to one another, to explain why they might work together, all these different things. It is the common thread throughout all of these stories that helps to tie the characters together and helps us link all these quests together that have kind of disparate ends to them. All right. So that is really what the Lorkhon particles and its related lore are all about. And again, this is a lore overlay created by me as a way of telling a story. So if Ashes dropped in 2017 and Rune Runner dropped in 2016, what was I doing in between? Well, I was coming up with these concepts, but I was also doing a whole bunch of other things during this year and a half. The podcast was going full steam. I did a whole series on Caranthir Tower. Started a little series with Matt and Joe called Wayward. That one didn't get too far. Experimented a lot with some other things. Did a mini series called Roger. Did a Pathfinder series. Did an entire Skyrim series called The Passage, which is completely unrelated to any of the Lorkhon content. There were a lot of things going on. And during each of these experiments, I learned something important. During Wayward, I learned a lot about introducing random elements and the importance of format. During Expedition Skyrim, I learned a whole bunch of things about video production. And diving into Roger, I learned about voice work and humor and comedic timing. And during The Passage, it was really a study of how I could create a story that was a looser format and still compelling. So I took all of these things, production, format, creativity, and this is when I really started to apply these concepts to Ashes. And I really wanted to do it right. Now, at this point, I didn't know whether or not Ashes was going to become something longer term. At first, I thought, well, Ashes is just a great story concept. It's kind of fun. We've got two characters introduced by Ashes, Marl and Shadling. These two are interlinked, and they are also bound together by their understanding of the Lorkhon particles, and we will review both of these characters in a later episode of this series. But that begs the question, what is it that makes a Lorkhon story a Lorkhon story? Is it the particles? Is it the powers? Is it the mystery and the mysterious happenings? Sure, it's all of these things. But if you really think about it, the thing that ties them all together is the presence of Robard Graves. Robard Graves, as I've said, is a character that I created during the Five Fables experiment and fell in love with. And so, while I didn't intend for Rune Runner to be a Lorkhon story, in fact, I hadn't even thought of the concept of Lorkhon particles at the time I created Rune Runner, one of the things that we see happen in that story is in episode 13 of Rune Runner. This episode is called Graves' Mistakes. Robard makes a sudden appearance, and this is when I'm really starting to, work on my ability to create NPCs. And suddenly, all of those viewers who remembered Robard from Five Fables were very excited to see him suddenly appear. It was a fun surprise. It was really sort of interesting. That episode came out on September 2nd of 2016. Robard suddenly then became the primary character in a couple episodes of Rune Runner, in particular episode 16 called Kingpin. We actually get to see many of the events in that episode are strictly from Robard's perspective. And this is when I started toying around with, how can I do this mechanically? Have two characters where I can share perspective, right? And so this is where the experimentation really, really started. And also, as a point of interest, Rune Runner episode 18, Pertham of Interest, that was released on October of 2016. There is a character in that episode named Pertham. And of course, this is a play on words, Pertham of Interest. And if you know anything about Marl, you'll understand why this is pertinent. The basis for the character of Marlivor Keenlit, who would be one of the primary characters in the Ashes series, comes from a character that I created as a one-off in episode 18 of Rune Runner. This character's name is Pertham, and if you watch that episode and know anything about Marlivor Keenlit from the Ashes series, you will understand where Marl comes from. So that's basically it, ladies and gentlemen. The Lorkhon particles explained. We talked a little bit about why it's important, why we need this larger umbrella narrative to kind of tie it all together, to glue all of these characters and stories together and make them feel cohesive. And we also talked a little bit about some of the production growth, some of the experimentation I was doing during this time that started leading me down this path. So, well, sometimes it's easy to look back and say that Rune Runner was just a one-off. It really, really wasn't. There were some very important things that happened in the latter half of Rune Runner. Yes, it introduced Vander, who became a key character in the series, but more importantly, that is when I started tying in the recurring character of Robard, and it was also the birth of the character that would become Marlivor Keenlit, who is probably the central figure, if you had to name one, in this whole series when it comes to tying in the concept of the particles and how they are affecting the people of Skyrim. All right, stay tuned for the next Nutshell episode, where we will discuss the origin and role of Robard Graves, the most prolific and mysterious character in the Lorkhon saga. For more information, check the description for links to the videos, podcasts, and resources I mentioned. You will also find the definitive Lorkhon timeline explaining all the playlists and characters that are part of the Lorkhon saga canon and the recommended viewing order. I will see you in the next episode.